Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Humanities in Session forum and to the Center for Humanities Research, if you haven't joined us before, the Iatsiba Lab, as we have self-anointed ourselves. I'm Kim Gurney. I'm a senior researcher here, and together with my colleague Lindelwe Delumba, we co-convene this monthly forum, which is a public-facing forum for invited scholars and our own scholars to share work in progress and also sometimes completed bodies of work, as we have today. A book, a new book launch and discussion, which is always a very exciting moment when a new body of work launches itself into the world. And we're very pleased to welcome back into the fold Mark Sanders, who is rejoining us. He came a while back. Let me just close my book because my hands are shaking away. Actually, that's my little prop for something I want to say a bit later. He joined us last year to share some ideas in progress that filter into this body of work, and we're very pleased to welcome you back to launch a book into the world, which is always a very special moment because books are long labors of love. They take a long time to condense and to find their way into the world. I guess it's a double-barreled thing because it's a celebration, but it's also kind of a goodbye because you wave that labor of love goodbye into the world. It becomes its own entity. It does its own thing. It has a life of its own, and it becomes almost like its own little entity. The death of the author, I suppose. But it's a very special moment, and thank you for bringing it to us to help in this kind of ritual as it goes into public sphere. I will just formally introduce our speakers, Mark, the author of the book, and Aidan, our respondent. And then I'll just have a brief prompt for the discussion, and then I'll hand over to Mark and Aidan, who will lead us through a discussion. And we also have some of our digital humanities fellows who have prepared some questions before we will seek into a Q&A from the floor. The event will last about 2 hours max, an hour and a half, 2 hours max. And you're encouraged to linger to engage Mark afterwards. We've got refreshments and so on. And also, please support Mark in purchasing the book if you can, or recommend it to your libraries and institutions. Book Lounge is outside selling his book as well as some other related titles. So Mark is a professor of comparative literature and English at New York University and extraordinary professor of Afrikaans and Dutch at Stellenbosch University. He's the author of several books, including the one we're launching today, A Will for the Machine, Computerization, Automation and the Arts in South Africa, Learning Zulu, A Secret History of Language in South Africa, Ambiguities of Witnessing, Law and Literature in the Time of a Truth Commission, and Complicities, the Intellectual and Apartheid. Aidan Erasmus is based in the Department of Historical Studies at UWC. His research encompasses the comparative histories of race, technology, and sense, with a special interest in sound. He's presented and published on topics relating to sound, technology, music, and memory, among other matters, and is involved in a number of research groups. His current research project concerns sound in the intellectual life of Solomon Tlali, an early 20th century African intellectual, in the context of the technology and sensorial ambit of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Actually, it might interest you to know that the color scheme of this building is derived from the juxtaposition of two books of Tlali's, Mahudi and Native Life in South Africa. The one's got like this red ochre color and the other's this linen green. And the artist, Maya Marks, saw the juxtaposition of those book titles and derived her color palette from that. I was told, and I totally disobeyed, which suits the title of this catalog, Disobedient Objects, by someone last week, that if you're talking, don't use your nasty little scrap piece of paper like I just did. You're supposed to hide it in a very erudite title. So I disobeyed, but Disobedient Objects is the title that I chose for you, Mark. And when I flipped it open, it opened up on a text by David Grieber on the phenomenology of giant puppets. And of course, one of the chapters in your book engages puppetry, although in a slightly different way. And I'm standing on top of a puppet studio right now. So if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read the first paragraph, and you may or may not want to riff off the topic of disobedient objects in response. But he writes, I begin with a simple observation. It's fair to say that if the average American knows just two things about the mass mobilizations of the anti-globalization movement, they are first that they often involve people dressed in black who break windows, and second that they involve colorful giant puppets. I want to start by asking why these images in particular appear to have so struck the popular imagination. I also want to ask why it is that of the two, American police seem to hate the puppets more. As many activists have observed, the forces of order in the United States seem to have a profound aversion to giant puppets. Often police strategies aim to destroy or capture them before they can even appear on the streets. As a result, a major concern for those planning actions soon become how to hide the puppets so they won't be destroyed in preemptive attacks. What's more, for many individual officers at least, the objection to puppets appears to be not merely strategic, but personal, even visceral. Cops hate puppets. Activists are puzzled as to why. I hand over to you, Mark, to lead us into how you arrived at the writing of your book, which is, I think, where you wanted to begin, and then Aidan will take over and lead us through into discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm not sure that I'll riff yet on what Graeber says about giant puppets, but it is certainly thought-provoking. Theorists of puppetry do talk about the uncanny valley, and perhaps that's why the police react with such violence, because of the uncanniness of the puppet, and perhaps the extra uncanniness of the giant puppet. Can you imagine how that would feature as the imago for some police officer? Yeah, so that's, I said I wouldn't riff, but I did. It's lovely to be back here. I feel almost embarrassed to have been invited back a second time within less than a year to talk about the same book. Somehow I don't think it's this book is important enough for that, but thank you for having me once again to the Center for Humanities Research. Thank you, Kim and Lindy, for helping organize this, to Moritz and to Premesh, who isn't here, for being so eager to have me back. And of course to Aidan for taking the trouble to read my book and engage with it. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I'm going to speak as briefly as possible. And when I extemporize from handwritten notes, it can sometimes be rather too long. So I know some of you are in performance. Maybe you can perform a yawn or something if it gets too long-winded. But I'll try to be brief, and then I'm going to read a short couple of paragraphs from the book. There are many places where I could read, so if there's time and the questions run out, I could read more from the book. I thought the other day that I'd exhausted the passages that I might want to read from it. And I looked at it this morning and I found several more. I thought, well, I think it depends on one's mood when one reads one's own work. One feels differently about it at different times of the day, different weeks or months or years. But those feelings are perhaps not as essential as the response that I eagerly await from Aidan and from, of course, from you as we continue. So I'm going to take the risk of speaking from this disobedient object that I have, this miniature illegal pad. You can see in the United States a yellow lined paper and pad like this is called a legal pad, but normally they're 8.5 by 11. This is a miniature one, and it restricts what you can write and what you can say. I always like to have everything on one page, but it's too small for that. It'll be a couple of pages, so bear with me. So the beginnings of this book, I mean, this is a Center for Humanities research, and so I know that there's a curiosity about method. How did you get from where you started to where it ended up? And so working backwards, always different ways of telling the story, but it's nice to hear from fellow researchers, you know, how they were inspired, and then how they realized that inspiration and how it changed along the way. So the starting point for this book, it goes back quite a long way. It was probably around 2016. I'd been an admirer of William Kentridge's work for a really long time. His animated film and his collaborations with Handspring Puppet Company, and wanted to write something about his work. I'd always found it very difficult to try to figure out how, because although the work engaged me immediately and struck me with its great beauty, I wasn't sure how I would write about it. I hadn't really written about visual art before. And at the same time, I also learned of the existence of early computer poetry by J.M. Coetzee, dating back to the 1960s, the early 1960s, when he worked for IBM in England, before he got his PhD in literature at Texas. So there were those two points of interest. I wanted to write about Kentridge, and then learnt about Coetzee's computer poetry, and the connection between the two bodies of work was automatism, or automatic processes, if you like. Rosalind Krauss, the art historian, art theorist, had written about quasi-automatism in Kentridge. And then I got talking to Rebecca Roach, who had written about automatism, automaticity, and modernism, and discussed Coetzee's computer poetry and also his fiction in that context. So in the beginning, this project started out with, on the one hand, inspiration that I derived myself from the work of Kentridge and of Coetzee, although less than, I think, an inspiration than a curiosity, because I had no ability as a computer programmer. I couldn't read the programs that are in the archive at Harry Ransom Center in Texas. So it was a way of actually following that curiosity. But so on the one hand, there's that, but on the other hand, there was the scholarship that other people had done, Rosalind Krauss and Rebecca Roach. And I don't think that that connecting theme of automatic processes, of automaticity, of automatism would have really been there without their work. So I stand on their shoulders in that respect. But at the same time, the work that they did, Krauss and Roach, seemed to lack a solid South African grounding. That these arguments about automaticity were not well grounded in either case in a knowledge of South African history, for example. So I started to ask whether the experiments of Kentridge and Coetzee with automatic processes, and again, Kentridge automaticity in animated films and in the puppetry with Handspring Puppet Company, whether those, and Coetzee with the programmed writing, whether those experiments might be connected to questions of labor automation in South Africa, specifically during the period of computerization, 1960 to 1980, the beginnings of computerization in South Africa through the really the advent of the microcomputer around 1980, which was also the at least the early part of that 20 years, also the high point of apartheid. So because there was no, at the time, no handbook on the history of computerization in South Africa, thanks, Aidan, I had to construct for myself in outline a history of computerization. And so that became the first part of the book and took a lot of labor, a lot of reading of to reconstruct that. So you could, if you're an economic historian or historian of technology, just read the first chapter and you would get that. But if you're interested in the arts, and I know you are, with the puppetry studio downstairs, you probably want to read the rest. But as to the first part of the book, one can make two observations. That debates about computerization and automation followed quite closely earlier debates, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere, on mechanization. So it became mainly about how a machine would substitute for a worker. And so many machines would substitute for many workers, although one machine could substitute for many workers too. It's an interesting sound. Yes, it's a very regular sound. Modernist, perhaps. Yeah. So on the one hand, these debates followed quite closely, ones which were current just about anywhere in the world where there was industrial capitalism and mechanization occurred. But I started to ask the question, well, maybe what might be different in South Africa? And so at the high point of apartheid, I discovered that the meaning of automation, and the meaning of automation is something that I stress. I'm from a literary background, so asking about, well, what does this or that mean for people at a particular time? That philological question started to become the guiding thread. And so I'm unable to say, after all of the research that has gone into the book, is that someone selling fish?
Welcome to Woodstock.
Yeah, I know that sound. It's a pre-vuvuzela sound. I come by the fish. It's ready. It's come from the dock, right? Yeah. So I can't say that things are radically different in South African, the meaning given to automation and computerization, but there is this important twist. So on the one hand, historically, if you look at it historically and sociologically, you have this concern that machines are going to substitute for workers. and but on the other hand, then there are two things where this attains less a negative valence than a more positive one. And the one way in which it becomes more positive, and that's where the title, The Will for the Machine, comes from. I talk about a general will for the machine, is that jobs involving the use of machines were better paid. And so people wanted them. People wanted those jobs. And so for people who had a certain standard of education, and as we know in this country, that was often racially differentiated. The machine provided a path in upward mobility. And I think I've just begun to glimpse the historical significance of that. On the other hand, however, for apartheid ideologues, and this was perhaps more at the level of theory, or if you like, fantasy, the machines also provided a way to re-racialize a workplace that was in the process of being de-racialized as a result of the introduction of technology, of machines. And I looked specifically at the office as a workspace, where women, and specifically black and colored women, were, well, more colored and Indian women, but then slowly more black women were entering the workplace. So the apartheid ideologues thought if you introduced more machines into your workspaces, specifically factories and offices, they thought that they could get more white women to go on the labor markets, basically, and thereby free up the labor of white men to work jobs in other sectors that they wished to keep white. So it was a twisted and convoluted argument involving race and technology. And there are other aspects to it, but there is evidence for this position ideologically. So this is my contribution to the meaning of automation in computerization in South Africa at that time. And of course, this changes over time. But this is, I think, particularly interesting. So office work becomes the site of change and of struggle over the racialization of labor, and also, to a certain extent, the gendering of labor too. And later on, I won't go into detail, the changes take place not simply around office work, clerical work, but also around computer programming. The computer programmers also become a vector in the de-racialization of the South African workspace around the late 70s and early 80s. But this set of insights, which came from looking at labor statistics and other sources, took me back to Miriam Tlali's novel, Muriel at Metropolitan, published in 1975, which is set around 1965 in an office. It's the only pure work of office fiction in South African literature. I defy you to find another one that's only about office work. There are others where they deal in one way or another with office work, but Muriel at Metropolitan is the only work of office fiction. I mean, I hope to be corrected, but I think it's still the only one. So the office becomes a site of struggle. This is set in 65, I think I said that, struggle over the mechanization of the office. And by also at the same time a struggle over job reservation. So the racialization of that, of labor and division of labor within that office. So I wrote about Tlali in this context, and then I circled back to J.M. Coetzee, whose only published computer poem appeared in the first volume of Staff Rider in 1978, at the same time as Miriam Tlali's column, Soweto Speaking, began in Staff Rider. You're looking at your watch. Am I taking too long? All right. So how did all of this apply? I'm going to be very brief now. With Coetzee, it was fairly straightforward, actually. If you read his book Youth, which is a fictionalization of his time in London and of his computer programming career, when Youth discusses the use of a computer to compose lines of poetry. But in all of that, if you look at that in the context of related works by Coetzee, you can see that his qualms about doing that, about automating the process of writing, are not just related to the work of writing, but also to work more generally. And he being a white descendant of colonials, feels, or at least the character in Youth and in Summertime, the other fictionalized autobiography, they really are suspicious of anything that would automate manual work, because guilt-ridden whites should be doing manual work, right? And not members of colonized populations. And so there's this ambivalence around using a computer, which is related not just to writing, but to labor more generally. And so Coetzee's experiments in computer poetry, although they might not seem related to this context to begin with, are, I argue, fairly deeply implicated in it. Kentridge is more complex, and the Kentridge experts in the room will find this interesting and maybe disagree. So I had to, I chose specifically, I know Kentridge is prolific and he's made so many of these films too, so does one want to be exhaustive? No, I'm a literary scholar and I'm a philologist, and so you try to pick the most productive example. So I picked Stereoscope, a film that some of you might be familiar with, made in 1999. And in Stereoscope, it opens with an old-fashioned telephone exchange with the telephonists or telephone operators plugging in cables, cords, to connect calls. This is what happened 100 years ago in the early days of telephony. I read this and other images of his in, I think, quite an audacious way. I mean, I have to really find out via the grapevine, how this goes down in the Kentridge universe. But I'm not really worried. I mean, about how it goes down. I think it'll be interesting for them. So I read it as evoking the political world of William Kentridge's grandfather. Did you know he had a famous grandfather? You knew he had a famous father who is 103 years old, Sidney Kentridge, but his grandfather was Maurice Kentridge. And Maurice Kentridge was the leading member of the 1922 white miners' strike and revolt. Maurice Kentridge is quite open about this. He writes about this in his memoir, I Recall. It's not hidden, it's in the public record. and he explains his reasons. And represented the Labour Party for more than 30 years in Parliament. Now, the 1922 miners' strike is infamous as a kind of unholy alliance between white supremacy and trade unionism. So you could say socialism and white supremacy. The terms you can pick what terms, but white supremacy is quite important. There's a famous banner that was raised: "Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa." So this is Maurice Kentridge. Sidney Kentridge was born in 1922, just after the end of the strike and the revolt. So what is interesting, and I discovered this, it was a complete fluke. I was in the National Library in Pretoria looking at Live Wire magazine. Live Wire magazine was the magazine of the telephonists and telegraph workers. I don't think it was postal workers, but they had their own labor association, and they published Live Wire. And Live Wire has a lot about the telephonists, because this was the time when the exchanges were starting to be automated in South Africa and elsewhere. South Africa has actually been a leader in telecommunications early adoption, let's say. And so by 1920, there were already telephone exchanges that were being automated in South Africa, in Port Elizabeth, and Cape Town was a little later. But so these white trade unionists were quite concerned about the loss of jobs of their members, and so Maurice Kentridge spoke up in Parliament in 1926 on behalf of the telephonists. I give a long account of this and longer account in the book, so I won't repeat all that. But in terms of Maurice Kentridge's politics, the Labour Party in the Pact government, we studied this in history in standard 8 or 9, I think, so we know all about this. But this is 100 years ago, 1926. I don't know if people even know this, but the Labour Party and the National Party joined in government under Prime Ministership of Hertzog. And the Labour Party were a big part of how the National Party government, that particular government, pushed very, very strongly for a colour bar in the Labour context. I mean, I won't go into the details of that history. You then have to skip a generation, all that 103 years of Sidney Kentridge's life. Forget about that. William Kentridge himself, as a student in student politics at Wits in the 1970s, became involved in workerist causes and devoted some of his artistic production to that. And perhaps the most important was his work for, I was going to say Handspring Puppet Company, Junction Avenue Theatre Company, where he, I won't go into all of the plays they did for, in the context of trade unionism, but they did that. But their first play was called The Fantastical History of a Useless Man. You're nodding your head. You saw it in 1976. Right, yeah, it was first performed in 1976. So it's a series of vignettes from South African history, from Van Riebeeck, I mean, colonial South African history, to their present in the 1970s. And it touches on the 1922 strike. It doesn't mention Maurice Kentridge. I'm not sure if William Kentridge was aware of Morris's role at that point, or whether he cared. But in this dramatic moment, and there are photographs of this, a banner which is in two parts, it's been cut in half, is joined. And that banner is the banner of the workers in 1922. Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa. So clearly this, the dynamics of 1922 were ones that were being rejected by Kentridge, William Kentridge and his generation. So whether or not this was done consciously, it's clear that there is an important relationship between the Morris generation and the William generation that is being articulated, that is being put on stage. And I won't go into too much detail about how the racial politics of the Labour Party with Morris Kentridge he articulated race and technology. It did. It's complicated, and I spent time in the book discussing it in more detail. But in any case, William Kentridge's own Labour politics that came into being in the crucible of the 1970s in Johannesburg, Wits University, where he studied politics and African studies, come into his work in two main ways. And one is having the figure of the worker on stage. And the other way is, I contrast these two ideas, the figure of the worker and the inner workings. And the inner workings are what connect the human and the machine, because machines and humans, to some extent, work in the same way. I mean, that's the assumption anyway, right? And you find both of these aspects in Kentridge's work, and it comes to the fore specifically in puppetry as the puppeteer and puppet interact, the fact that there is this coincidence. The human needs to act in a certain way. Are any of the puppeteers here today who would probably be able to articulate this better than I can, but the puppet is designed to be interacted with in a particular way and in no other way. If you've ever tried as a beginner to manipulate a puppet, you'll know that it will only interact with you in one way, in the one way that it's designed to do. If you try to interact with it in a different way, it's no longer a puppet. It's just a bunch of wood or cloth or paper mache. So that's what you learn. You learn what the puppet wants from you. And it's the same as the cell phone. You have to learn what the cell phone wants from you before you can use it, right? So this is why Kentridge and Handspring and their collaborations are really informative for how we interact with technology and how the arts respond in more generally to processes, automation and computerization. So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs before we converse. I hope that wasn't too long. I didn't see anyone performing a yawn. You could perform it with a puppet, like right, wide sock puppet, like that, maybe. Anyway, let me find the passages that I had in mind. So,
do you want to perhaps read one excerpt and then we can begin my conversation and then we can move forward like that?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good. So this is the puppet rhinoceros from Wojciech on the Highveld, Handspring's design drawing for it. Wits University Press chose the hindquarters of the rhinoceros. I'm glad they did, because I mean, to have that that horn, I mean, it's kind of phallic. I mean, there was that when I was learning Zulu, there was that Maskanda song, Kunzi Kabejane, something like that. Or, and you know, you don't want that kind of phallicism, right? On a book cover, on a book that is so much about gender and about women workers. So I'm pleased that they decided on this one. I like the design. So anyway, Wojciech on the Highveld was an adaptation for the puppet theatre of a early 19th century play called Wojciech by the German dramatist Georg Bichner. So when I mention Bichner, I'm referring to this 19th century German author. So this is much too small, but we have here Basil Jones and Adrian Kohler on the same page. They are with their little rhino. So you can see the scale. If you can see far enough, you can see it's miniature. Anyway, so this is really small print. Maybe I should take off my glasses to read it, but I'll try to preserve the look. About halfway into Wojciech on the Highveld, there is a scene in which the fairground barker, played by Ncedisi Shabangu in the 2008 revival, Wojciech on the Highveld goes back to, I think it's 1992, so it was revived, and doing his best to translate his heteroglossia into something sounding South African. In the original, it's a kind of mixture of Low German and French. Invites the audience in the house to behold what sounds like the astronomical dicerometon. In other words, the Dicerus bicornis, or black rhinoceros, in the form of an automaton. That would figure. The marvelous beast is a puppet miniature rhinoceros placed on a table, and Basil Jones and Adrian Kohler, its two manipulators, are in plain view. A puppet, as much as a bicycle, say, is a near automaton, although there is no way that it could be started up and left to run on its own, as the automata of Bichner's time did by means of wind-up clockwork mechanisms that produced the same effects every time. It also cannot move by itself. It thus offers an occasion to reflect on what we mean by automatic. What do the members of Handspring say about the puppet's automatism? Their commitment to humanist and animist ideas about puppetry remains firm. Basil Jones tells us, for example, that the puppet seeks life. The puppeteers are nevertheless rigorous in never eliding the careful artifice involved in making puppets. This artifice makes it possible for the puppeteer, by following a regular and predictable series of movements, to produce an acceptable illusion of life. Achieving such predictability is the greater part of the preparation for any production. As much is clear from the descriptions of the modifications the company needed to make to the puppets in warhorse, so it would be possible for the puppeteers to work with them without developing repetitive strain injuries. The puppet may thus be viewed as primary. As Basil Jones, speaking on a different occasion, explained to an interviewer, you're always serving the puppet. And when serving the puppet is painful, you can easily start thinking of it as an enslavement. I've just come from an operating theatre where I had surgery because the last play I did was so painful that I did some damage to the tendons in my arm. In the conditions of possibility for this illusion, the human conforms to what is made possible by a machine or tool constructed in a certain way, just as other things are not made possible or made not possible. Although the puppet depends on its puppeteer as its animator in performance, as artist and Handspring collaborator Gerhard Marx rightly observes, one discerns as one of its conditions of possibility a system of automation that should make us hesitate to oppose it to the automaton or machine. Animation, whether in film or puppetry, depends on automation. Even if Basil Jones is correct to call the puppetry very old-fashioned technology, it may not be inaccurate to view puppets and their puppeteers in performance as cyborgs, the term used by theorists of less old-fashioned modern media to describe entities reducible neither to human nor machine, but operating through their interdependence. This is an insight developed in different ways by contemporary theorists of puppetry. Most examples of the cyborg historically involve a high degree of programming. Applying the term in a general way, this means that the human user has to learn to conform to the device or software platform, like the regularity and predictability of motion sought after during the design phase of the horse puppets in Warhorse. If tradition tells us that the non-human puppet depends on the human puppeteer for life, the reverse may be equally true, that the life of the human entity depends on whatever the non-human entity allows by virtue of its design. If true, it is true not only for puppeteers, but for any user of a machine or tool. It is nevertheless the case that in an age of programmable machines, whether of the 19th or the 21st century, the puppet will be a but. In that epoch, the puppet is a reminder and trace of the irreducible excess or remainder of skilled work by the human hand. At a more allegorical level, it issues a claim on behalf of the life abiding within the human being, who through training and mindless labor has come to function or to work like a machine. In a persona alternately menacing and desperate to draw laughter or applause, the Barker and Wojciech on the Highveld demonstrates what the performing diceromaton can do. And I quote his entire speech in the book. It's much too long to read, and I would want an actor to perform that. It's quite wonderful. So I'll stop there and hand it over to you, Aidan.
Thanks, Mark. I'm not going to try and perform it either. I'm not a rhinoceros, if you haven't noticed. I thought we could have something of a bit of a conversation about some of my thoughts, but I think maybe after your very extensive discussion so far, I'm wondering if I can just pull out maybe one or two things that struck me about the book, which I've been working through for the last month. And it's been as if I've been listening to you talk now. So when you were mentioning parts of the book, it's like, oh, I remember that part. I remember. So it was quite nice. I think it's worth starting with kind of where you left off there, which was around this idea of the illusion that the puppet kind of produces, and how you connect that to the question of automation. And there is a concept that you use in the book that I'm hoping to just kind of unfold a bit here, and we can talk a bit about it. And that concept is the concept of anamorphosis. And I think really, if I read the core premise of your book to be that the question of labor and the machine shifts dramatically with this kind of process of mechanization, then automation, and ultimately computerization. And then that comes to restructure for artists, really, in some sense, the human-machine interaction. And if that's the case, then anamorphosis as a concept, in my reading of your work, is meant to capture the kind of, we might call it the representational excess of this interaction between the human and machine in the wake of the shift that happens through mechanization, then automation, then computerization. And obviously the puppet is definitely a useful place to explore that, because it does represent what you call the uncanniness that I think the anamorphic is meant to invoke. I know that the term itself comes out of a long history of visual art practice, but in the book itself, and I'll share a few quotes and definitions as they stood out to me with some, I hope I have the license to paraphrase, but it is defined a little bit differently in the book. For example, in chapter 3, you describe it as something that makes the invisible visible. In chapter 4, you say it invites those who observe it closely to discern something else. You also describe it as a metaphor for using a computer. You say it's some technical means is required for something unintelligible, and anamorphosis is that which makes that thing intelligible. It is the process of the instantaneous conversion of keystrokes into recognizable patterns of light. And then in the conclusion, you use this very interesting phrase, which I think we should sit on for a minute, which is this idea that anamorphosis is, quote, the regulated transformation of one order of marks into another. So anamorphosis, in my reading, strikes me as a way to make sense of what we might call the productive deceit of the machine. That representational deceit that's core to how the machine, specifically the automaticity of the machine, works and functions. And I found that very intriguing, because in my own work on sound, I found an analog in phonography, or what is the history of sound reproduction technology. And for those of you who don't know, early sound recording involved a machine called a phonograph, which basically had a membrane that would pick up a vibration, and those vibrations would then be reproduced by a needle on a wax cylinder, right? And that it's very important that we note that you could see that process, right? And the grooves made by the needle on the wax cylinder would then be a record of those vibrations, right? And so the phonograph and the gramophone, which couldn't record, would then simply reverse the process of inscription. There would be a little switch, and the grooves would then be read. And as you say, Mark, the regulated transformation of one order of marks into another would happen. And in the practice of phonography in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this is called eduction, or to educe the inscription. And this concept of eduction, I found it almost analogous to what I think you're trying to do or trying to get at with the concept of anamorphosis, insofar as it's thinking about how one brings forth something from a space of latent potentiality. In a sense, like you say, the machine, like the puppet, only is wedded to the human in the sense that it comes to life through its operator, right? And you refer to the operator repeatedly through the text. And the concept of reduction relies on the one hand, this idea of representation. So it's representation, but it's the representation of something latent. And then also the notion of transduction, which I mentioned before. And transduction really is to change the quality of something into another. And this is the big theme of the kind of electrochemical and sensory technologies of the 19th century, right? Trying to figure out how do you, I mean, photography is one of those things that comes out of, they're all transductive mediums in some sense. And so I'm very interested how you might think about anamorphosis as a transductive process, right? As the way you describe computerization as, quote, a system of regulated conversion of representationally inert marks into meaningful syntagms and recognizable images. There's some kind of process of transformation there that is at once, I think, ideological, but also technological. There's a profound technological process going on there. So this kind of transductive process that, in my view, is the same that was fundamental to the electrochemical media of the 19th century and key to the notion of machines without labor, as in the machines themselves do the transformational work, the universal of the universal machine, right? I too have visited the Kentridge universe in my scholarly career. In my PhD, I tried to think about how it is a radio shout-out sent in to Esme Everard to play on Force's favorites that ended up being played to the boykies on the border, so to speak, ended up being the kernel of a work by Kentridge called Casper's Full of Love. And there I could have used the term anamorphosis, which is why I found this very, very useful. So it'd be interesting to hear, I mean, as a start, maybe we can start there to hear if there's any thoughts on how, or what, well, firstly, how you're thinking about the concept of anamorphosis and whether it is, in my reading, the central kind of conceptual thrust you want to make in the book, and how you think transduction might change this in any way.
Thanks, Aidan. And that's a big question. A couple of questions. I think yes, anamorphosis is probably the central concept. And when I began to try to connect Kentridge and Coetzee right in the beginning, I used that concept. And although that particular piece wasn't published in the book, I published it in Puppetry International Review. I did summarize part of that in the chapter, the final chapter. I did use some paragraphs from that. So it was there from the beginning, and I think when I came back to it as I was completing the book back in the days of the pandemic in 2021, it became newly central and important in trying to communicate what I was trying to say about how artists and writers were responding to these technological changes. And although Coetzee doesn't, when he refers to his computer poetry, which is very rarely, he doesn't use that term. It does come up in Kentridge. Anamorphosis is the transformation of a distorted image. It's a visual, it's a concept in art. A distorted image is transformed into an image which you can actually recognize as being of this or that thing or this or that person. And and so they work either you can tilt your head. So Hans Holbein's painting The Ambassadors, if you look at it from a certain angle, you can see that something in the foreground which you didn't quite recognize before is a skull, a memento mori, a reminder of death, of mortality, and that's a 16th century painting. So it's been around a long time in visual arts. It can also, you can also have anamorphic images which resolve into recognizable images through the use of a mirror. And Kentridge has done a couple of pieces where either he uses drawings or animated films, moving images that work in this way. Some of his most beautiful work, What Has Come Has Already Come, is that the right title? That anamorphic projection on a cylindrical mirror on a table about this size. Yeah, it's highly central, and I think what I try to do, you can certainly, I mean, all of the observations you make about the recording technology and the reproductive technology, those technologies that emerged in the 19th century, you could describe in terms of anamorphosis. I think to some extent I'm, like a lot of us writing about technology, I'm influenced by Friedrich Kittler, who writes about this history, and he sees those as the precursors to digitization, so the gramophone. But I mean, you're right to point to the phonograph, really is the most significant side of where those are first converted into marks which are not legible to a human being, but need to be made legible by the gramophone so that a human being can hear. So, I mean, what is really interesting in what you're saying, I'm not confident that I quite know these terms well enough, transduction, to fully answer your question. But I mean, it is quite remarkable that your starting point being sound relates so closely. I mean, there's such clear parallels between how it relates to my starting point in the visual arts. So there's a relationship in the arts as the arts start to encounter what is recognizably for us modern technologies, which involve not only mechanism but also electricity. I mean, that's really the decisive break that you have in the 19th century when electricity is introduced, because you don't have computers as we know them without electricity. It's not imaginable without that. So that, I think that's incredibly enriching for me to find you stating that parallel. But I think the difference that I try to establish, and perhaps it's not much of a difference, but for me it's crucial to think of the anamorphic as being involved in the experience of using particular technologies. So the phenomenality, the phenomenon of using a computer mouse. And so this is where Kentridge describes it very well. He describes using a computer mouse as anamorphic, because the movements that you perform with your hand are in one shape, but the line that you draw with the mouse in a drawing program is of a different shape. It's almost the reflex of that. So an awareness of that, I think what Kentridge is saying, and certainly what I'm saying, an awareness of that anamorphic process or transductive process is something which allows us to engage critically with the technologies that we are dependent on. Maybe that's not saying much, but it's the beginning of something, because you need to have, in order, I mean, this is a normative statement. If you want to have a critical relation to the technology that you use, you need to start somewhere. You have to have something, an idea, a concept in your mind, which is not a concept that you've been given by the technology itself. And so this is where referring to the phonograph and to the gramophone is key, because it's not a technology we use anymore. It's from outside of our technological world. And Kentridge shows us how those older technologies, including the gramophone, those old telephone exchanges, how they provide, because they make visible those processes, how they provide a critical framework, a possible critical framework. And I mean, I'd ask you whether you can see any analogy in the world of sound, what with these older technologies. I mean, I've been talking about how you can see something, but are there things that you can hear that might provide the same sort of critical distance from contemporary technologies if you were to refer to older sound technologies?
I think, because I want to make a point about the interface, which I think is where, how I would respond to that particular question, in the sense that a lot of the ways of working with, and I guess you see this in photography, I mean, you see this in film, you see this in sound, where a lot of things that were before manual exercises that you would do are now represented in a digital kind of interface. It's ironic because I read this book on an e-reader. So I kind of read this book on with an interface, which was very strange. And I had lots of issues with it, which I won't get into now. I did feel a bit like a telephone operator actually sitting behind the kind of exchange, because at some point, in order to move to the next page, I needed to like switch off, switch on, and then, okay, cool, now I've got a page and I can like work with the page. So it was a bit like I had to have my own, in order for the machine to respect me, I needed to, so it was very strange, and I mean, I was yeah, there was some kind of meta conversation I was having in my head about the interface, like in a way, the telephonists that you mentioned were already working an interface that like we do now as laborers in the data economy, you could say. And in a way, there's the coal face, and then there's the telephone exchange, and now there's the screen. There's like a kind of thing there. I want to kind of move from that to ask another kind of probe another part of the text that I found interesting, and then after this I'll kind of give you a chance to respond, and then I'll open it up a bit, which is, and it's kind of related to the question of the interface in a way. You raised it in your kind of introductory remarks as well, but this kind of lack of a computer history in South Africa, which I assume you mean a history of computerization. And I quite like alternating between the two and thinking what that means. I mean, in chapter 1, you say no history of computerization in South Africa exists in the form of a single ready reference. In chapter 4, you say South Africa never really had a cybernetics moment. No basic chronicle for computer history. If you are a computer historian, consider yourself like shots fired. Mark is coming for you. But I wondered about it as like a profoundly disciplinary and a kind of historiographical question. So I have a quote that's on my office door. I don't know where it came from. I think it was screenshotted from a Zoom meeting. But it reads, The new visual, oral, and tactile technologies of historical mediation have evoked Luddite sentiments amongst those historians who feel threatened in their traditional existence as artisan wordsmiths. Now, it's not that I agree or disagree with that comment, but I thought it was cool to have on my door. You know, everyone who passes is going to be like, what the is going on here? In fact, we had an AI education firm visit us who do like historical reconstructions, and they actually cited it in their email to me. Say, oh, I see you like one of us, like, you know, look, the Luddites weren't so bad. If you got an email from me, you'll know in my signature there's a little thing to them. But in your, I'm raising this because in your, because I'm interested in what you think the stakes are of this thing you're calling a computer history. So in your conclusion, you have this brief moment where, and I'm paraphrasing again here, where I think you imply that the humanities is a little afraid of the machine, right? And that, in a way, the humanities associates mechanization with dehumanization, which I think runs both alongside and counter to some of the arguments that have come through this space in a lot of ways. And so I would be very interested to hear what you think about this thing that you're calling a computer history, right? And attached to that, at times you make the argument that, you know, either analogy or concept metaphor would be an appropriate method for what you call a computer history. And here, I failed as a historian because I don't have a footnote for where that came from. But I think there's something about a certain kind of historical imagination that is adequate to the machinic or the technical or the anamorphic or the transductive that I think you're calling for in this idea of a computer history. And that's something that I would personally like to hold on to. I was thinking, and I mentioned this to you before, I was thinking, is there a way in which a computer history might begin before the age of computerization, right? For example, would there be a way to think about earlier encounters with calculating machines? So you talk about, I mean, another question I had, which you don't have to answer now, and my brain's going in 15 places at once, but like offices had machines before computers. They had, like you mentioned the counting house, you mentioned like they had calculating machines. So there is a way in which the machine is not new to the office or to the, like the bureau, you know, like as a thing. But I digress, but like thinking of Kimberley, for example, as the first city in Africa to have electricity and the first in the Southern Hemisphere to have electric streetlights, you know, or someone like Enoch Songtonga who wrote the national anthem, like he was a photographer. His obituary says he was a photographer. I'm being a bit selfish now, but I do think there's something there worth holding on to. And I think I should just like ask one last question and then have you respond and then we'll move on. Something that I found interesting is obviously, I suppose you're trained as a literary scholar, so that is the way you're going to come at things. But I found it very interesting as thinking about literature as a mode or literature as a method for a computer history, for thinking about what a computer history can do and what it can be. I recently said to someone that like there should really be a study on Bloke Mordesani's radio plays of the 1960s, and that would be something really interesting. But it made me think of this as a quote by a Hungarian mathematician called Alfred Renyi, who wrote this book called A Diary of Information Theory, which is basically a fictional diary of a student who takes a course at a university in information theory. And it's designed as a book to teach people about mathematics. But like there's an opening letter there about how, it's completely fictional, about how the professor discovered this manuscript and how he can't reveal the name, and then he reveals the name, and it's like this whole, like, anyway, it's very interesting. But the quote reads as follows. It says, "Since I started to deal with information theory, I have often meditated upon the conciseness of poems, how a single line of verse contained more information than a highly concise telegram of the same length. The surprising richness of meaning of literary works seems to be in contradiction with the laws of information theory. The key to this paradox, I think, the notion of resonance. The writer does not merely give us information, but plays on the strings of the language with such virtuosity that our mind and even the subconscious self resonate. A poet can recall chains of ideas, emotions, and memories with a well-turned word. In a sense, writing is magic. So I'm just very interested in how we might bridge this gap between the humanities and the kind of sciences and technology, and whether or not something like computer history might be an opening to think about the arts and the machine together. I mean, building upon what you've put forward.
I don't know if you read the acknowledgements, but I do credit my lecturers in economic history for showing me the way to writing what I hope, I mean, I may not have covered all the bases, but which is something of a granular history of computerization. I mean, in some respects, I think when writing about Port Elizabeth, what used to be Port Elizabeth in 1960s, and the municipality gets a computer. But I think, you know, maybe what your question is getting at is that as a philologist trying to write a granular history, what I'm most focused on when I write computer history or history of computerization, and again, I'm standing on the shoulders of other people. This is not entirely new. I think of Paul Edwards, a Closed World, for example, where he's the first one, in today somewhat kind of clunky way, appeals to discourse analysis as essential for writing computer history. Because what he says is that you have basically two kinds of histories of computerization. One written by the computer corporations, by IBM principally, and that tells the story in one way, as a history of business transactions, of mergers and acquisitions. And then you have the other form of computer history is written by scientists or engineers, the people who make computers, and so they see the history of computerization in a very in an equally narrow way, as involving technological change, or they would say technological advances. So you have the IBM 1401, and then you have the IBM whatever 3000 or I forget, or 300, System 300, System 360 it's called, yeah. And then, you know, the IBM will describe that in one way, but the computer scientists will describe that in a different way. But equally, those are lacking in great attention to social and historical context, to ideology. I think you used that word earlier. And Edwards wants to show how these technologies are implicated in their time. I won't refer to his examples, but that's what I'm trying to do when I appeal to the meaning of computerization. It's not one thing. Technology is not one thing. Its meaning in a given context is what tell you what it is, essentially. That's the phenomenality. I'm not that much interested in the essence of computerization. That's something that, how would you determine? Heidegger talked about the essence of technology. I allude to that constantly because I think it's an interesting question. But I'm not trying to answer that question. I'm trying to answer, well, phenomenologically, in terms of the phenomenon, what does it mean to use a computer, a machine, or a tool? So that's my effort at writing computer history and the history of computerization in this country specifically. Were you asking me, saying that, well, associating the humanist who says that machines are dehumanizing and so on, you're saying, well, that's not what you hear here, that people who come and speak about these matters don't speak about it in those terms.
No, I think what I'm saying that the question of dehumanization and technology is not necessarily kind of attached to like method in the humanity, like the humanities aversion to technology is not necessarily always based on a fear that technology will dehumanize. I think that's the kind of the claim that that in your conclusion there is a claim that seems to suggest that. So so I think that it's not always reflected that way, for me at least.
So where does the aversion come from then?
I'm not sure. I'm asking you. I guess my question really about it is, firstly, like why where does your sense come from that the humanities is fearful of, or averse to, or hesitant maybe is a better word. Let's use less. But I think hesitant is the word I'll go with. Like, why do you think the humanities is hesitant to think about the machine?
Well, when I wrote the book and I was trying to bring everything together, this idea of will for the machine, this idea that workers at a particular time in South Africa wanted to use machines. I mean, shall I gossip? I mean, these are the things that influence one's work, things people say. I was, at the second half of 2019, I was at STIAS and I was presenting the beginnings of this work and writing about Miriam Tlali, who herself and the women she interviews, and they express a will for the machine, whether it's typewriter. Tlali is ambivalent about the typewriter, or the sewing machine. The women she interviews sew for a living, and they sew at home instead of being factory workers. There's a will for the machine. But another fellow at STIAS, a fellow who was a fellow, excuse me, a fellow who was a fellow, you see, that's poetry, and but AI can do that now, probably. So forget about that. But he was aghast that there could have been these women in the 1970s who actually wanted to work with machines, and he said, "What about Marx and how the machine dehumanized people and factory workers?" I suppose he was alluding to. So I kind of took this to heart, and I thought, well, yeah, I mean, this is a kind of Marxist humanist cliche, but still, if people must still abide by this idea that, well, if you work with a machine, you're being dehumanized, you're becoming an extension of the machine, and so on. Fine, but then what do you do? How do you theorize this will for the machine? Are you going to theorize it simply as false consciousness and say, well, no, you shouldn't want that? No. So this is, it was a bit of a defensive reaction, and I'm sorry if it's so infiltrated my work that it now leads to contradiction. Again, I mean, that's the dialectic, the importance of dialogue. It's nothing of what I've written can be written in isolation. It has been written in isolation from some kind of dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue is not comfortable. It's not as gemütlich as the dialogue we're having. But yeah, and then another example, colleagues of mine who are quite activist recently circulated a letter that they wrote to one of the high-ups in the university, challenging the university's use of an online platform where you would enter your publications and university service and teaching for the purposes of getting a pay raise. And they circulated they claimed in this letter to the upper administration that if you logged onto the system, ordinary user like myself, I could access the full text of anybody who was using the system, not only at my university, but at a host of other universities using the system. I very much doubt that this is the case. But they are humanists and are quite suspicious about interacting with these vast automated systems. I don't know where that fear comes from, but it's there as a minority fear. So I do think that there are these knee-jerk reactions to technology that you find both within scholarly seminars and then among one's colleagues, which perhaps would become a little bit less if people thought a bit more about how they used technology and how technology is using them. Because the idea of preserving confidential information to now these days, I mean, that horse is bolted. You can't preserve, you can't keep anything secret anymore. I mean, you'd have to work very hard to do that. I mean, Ian McEwan's novel, What We Can Know, if you've read that. Anyone read that? His most recent novel? That's asks that question and finds an answer to that. Well, what can we know? Because there's why can't you know a certain thing? And it's because there's a certain set of reasons that he gives in the narrative. But yeah, I mean, you just have to realize, well, some battles you're not going to win, not even worth fighting for. But anyhow, I mean, I'm not going to address all of the other points that you make. I mean, you know, what these questions really are productive, and I want to elaborate more. But I think let's continue. Let's let the event unfold.
That's perfect. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to. There are three fellows of the Digital Humanities Chair in Culture and Techniques, which is here at the CHR, who are each going to ask a question to Mark. They've also had time to engage with the book, hopefully not partly in the digital format, I think. So I'm going to hand over to the three of you. Each of you will ask a question. And then, Mark, I'll give you a brief moment to respond, and then we'll open the floor for, I think, about 15 minutes or so.
Hi, I'm Brooke. I'm busy with my master's in philosophy. So throughout the book, you obviously speak about how automation and the machine and computerization change labor in a number of ways, one of which is the division of labor. But what really interested me was the value of labor. So both the value of the product of labor, but also the value of the laborer. And I just wanted to know if you, at any point while working on this project, kind of just thought about how that change in value was internalized by the laborer themselves, especially the Black female laborers. Yeah, thank you.
Doing my master's thesis. My question is also in continuation to Brooke's question around labor, and particularly how our identities are tied to labor. As the human-machine organization evolve in their interaction, particularly meted out through the labor conducted, how do we relate to work? And particularly thinking about Marx's idea of historical materialism and this idea that human beings derive their meaning from their material conditions and the positions that they create. In what ways will humans find their purpose or even relate to their purpose, to the objects that they labor alongside? Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ava, and I'm in the history department, and I'm currently doing my PhD. So, I did have a different question initially, but through the dialogue on stage, I sort of thought of something else. I found the chapter on puppetry very interesting because I thought the way the puppeteer controls the puppet is, in a sense, an allegory for programming an AI chatbot, in a sense. And how you speak about the puppeteer and the person who controls it as a sort of semi-enslavement type thing, where the puppet is being controlled, but at the same time the person controlling it is sort of subjecting themselves to physical pain. And sort of how can you take that model and attach it to something like programming a chatbot? Like, are these AI tools a sort of new sort of form of slavery in a sense, like a digital and technical form? Or is that anthropomorphizing them too much,
Brooke, the value of labor and what self-valuation the worker internalizes, and specifically black women. I mean, I can really only talk about the women who I am writing about in the book, and specifically in the most detail with Miriam Tlali, but there's certainly the use of the machine for at least one of those interviewees, and you probably remember that oral history, Mrs. Kauai, who really gains enormous self-esteem through using an electrically powered sewing machine. And it's almost sensuous the way she talks about putting her foot on the pedal of the machine and getting it to run, and thereby also earning an independent living. She doesn't have to work in an office. She doesn't want to work in an office. She wants to work in a factory. It's better paid working in a factory those days. So there's a really positive valuation. But I think, there are, of course, the other examples in the book where it's less positive. The material that comes from Canada about the telephone operators' strike and how the telephone operator is continually on the, as Mackenzie King writes, on the qui-vive, like hyper alert, having to respond rapidly, almost instantaneously when the light comes on the switchboard and a call is coming in, and plugging in, unplugging, and so on. So she's working as this switch there. So almost literally, and people are making this observation that these women are human switches. They are literally part of the technology. They're so close to the technology and the way they interact with it, they may as well be another switch in the system. So I think these things are worth looking at in contexts. For sure. And so, Nosipo, maybe I can move on to your question. If we gain meaning as human beings, as Marx said, from the work that we do, I think in different instances that's going to differ how much meaning you get. I mean, from it, that Mrs. Kauai gets tremendous meaning from her use of a machine and the work that she does with it, the sewing machine. But the telephone operators who went on strike in 1906 in Toronto suffered as a result of that. And so the meaning is different. It's about pain, it's about trauma, it's about nervous effects. So you can, that's the spectrum. And then there, what is it the same Graeber called bullshit jobs, which are entirely meaningless for the worker, that you just, you're getting a paycheck, but what you're there for 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day doing, I mean, it's something that is not easy to find or impossible to find any meaning in. So again, I mean, it's a good question, because ideally you want to have meaning in what you're doing. I mean, I'm fortunate as a scholar to have found a great deal of meaning in what I do, but I know that that's not necessarily the case with everybody who gets a paycheck. But I'm glad that we're in the realm of meaning, that's a common currency for us in the humanities, that we're not simply asking, well, when we use Google Maps, for instance, our main concern is, well, will it get me from here to there? And so the meaning there is quite limited. It's in terms of technological efficiency and so on. And we don't ask those larger questions that often, although one might prefer a platform, an app like Waze, for example, because one finds the voice more compelling and so on. But again, but one's interacting with those technologies, even if regularly, briefly. What one does as one's work in one, say, 8 hours. Many people work longer than that each day, but one wants to find a little bit more in that than just efficiency and saying, well, it got me home, or it got me to Great Moore Street. So puppetry is an allegory for programming an AI chatbot. I've never done that. I've never interacted with the chatbot, so I don't know. I mean, it's compelling, I suppose, to think of it in that way. And I think, my question would be, does thinking about puppetry in the way that I write about it, does it give you a way of engaging critically with that process? I mean, I would leave it as a question rather. To clarify, in what I've been writing about in my chapter on Coetzee mainly, and I explore the implications in the other chapters, is the programming in 1962, I think it was, Coetzee programmed IBM 1401 computer to produce lines of poetry. It's not interesting as poetry, but he called his program line generator. He wasn't as ambitious. It wasn't ambitious enough or presumptuous enough to call it poetry, but it did take some programming imagination to program the computer to produce these lines. It wasn't a given. He had to write the program himself. And I did try to study programming a little in the first 6 months of this project in order to try to understand his programming in Fortran 2. I could see roughly how it worked once people at the Computer History Museum in California explained it to me. But I would have to do a lot more research now in order to sit with someone else and explain to them how this works. Because a lot of those steps are automated. If you use a contemporary programming language like, what was the one, Python that I used to practice. But one of the people who I spoke to looked at lines in the program and said, I mean, he was familiar with Fortran too. He was nearly as old as Coetzee and had worked with Fortran 2 quite a lot, and IBM 1401 and other big IBM computers. He said, that's a hack. In other words, this is not elegant programming. It's a hack. And so I wasn't at the level where I could tell the difference between this hack and what someone who thought of themselves as a poet of coding might have done. So, but this bears thinking about that. You know, the human tendency to want to find beauty in whatever they're doing, and you know, finding meaning. This is part of one way we find meaning. We find beauty. A human life is not simply about fulfilling goals and getting from A to B, but it's also about being in the moment and thinking, well, that sound of the fish cellar, there's something beautiful about that. So yeah, you know, this is really just having a conversation with you. It's not really answering the question, but I think I'll stop there. I mean, there were other things in your comments that I could address, but I think this is probably a good place to circle back to the beginning.
Mark, thank you so much. You know, it's wonderful to have you here. I mean, we've been thinking co-evolution of human and technology here for some time, these some familiar concepts and ideas, and to be in conversation with you, it's really meaningful for us, and thanks for adding these ideas so generously into our mix. And Aidan, thank you. I mean, it's every author's dream, I think you'll agree, for someone to pay such deep care and attention to your text.
I feel privileged to have had Aidan and 3 of you and the rest of you engage with my work in this way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Eva and Nosipo and Brooke for your engagements as well, which you always do in our forums. Thank you, and thanks for your patience and your attentiveness, the rest of you as well. Thank you. Please do linger afterwards. We have refreshments, and continue the conversation outside. Thanks a lot. Bye.